It's a story we all know, the ultimate fairy tale. A poor, forgotten girl, armed with nothing but her charm, captures the heart of a wealthy prince and is swept away into a life of unimaginable luxury. But what happens after the storybook closes? What if Cinderella had to fight the prince's 6 grown children in the trial of the century just to keep her glass slipper? Today we're delving into one of the most sensational and misunderstood rags to riches stories of the 20th century. It's a story that has it all: a penniless immigrant chambermaid, a reclusive billionaire, a shocking last will and testament, and a courtroom battle so vicious and so public it became a national obsession. She was dismissed as a gold digger, a schemer, a manipulative foreigner. But was she? Or was she a brilliant, ambitious woman who found an unlikely love and then had to fight a dynasty for her name, her fortune, and her legacy? This is the wild, complicated, and utterly captivating story of Barbara Piasecka Johnson. To understand the sheer force of will that propelled Barbara Piasecka into the stratosphere of global wealth, you first have to understand the world she was desperate to escape. She was born in 1937 in a rural part of Poland, a country that would soon be crushed between the twin evils of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Her childhood and young adulthood were spent not in a fairy tale kingdom, but in the gray, oppressive shadow of the Iron Curtain. Post-war Poland was a place of scarcity, conformity, and stifled dreams. Under communist rule, individual ambition was viewed with suspicion, and the opportunities to rise above one's station were almost non-existent. The cities were landscapes of grim, utilitarian apartment blocks, and the mood was one of weary resignation. But Barbara, or Basia as she was known, was different. She was a dreamer, with a passion for the one thing that offered an escape from the drab reality around her: art. She managed to get a fine arts degree from the University of Wrocław, specializing in art history. She was educated, intelligent, and possessed a fiery spirit. But in the Poland of the 1960s, a degree in art history was a passport to nowhere. Imagine the courage it took then, in 1968, for this 31-year-old woman to leave everything she knew behind. With little more than $100 in her pocket and a command of the English language that was shaky at best, she boarded a ship to the United States. She wasn't just seeking a new life, she was seeking a world of color, of possibility, of beauty, the very world she had only ever seen in the pages of her art books. She was stepping out of the gray and unknowingly heading straight for the Gilded Age. When Barbara Piasecka landed in America, the fairy tale was nowhere in sight. The woman with a master's degree in art history found herself working menial jobs just to survive. Then a Polish-American employment agency sent her on an interview that would change the course of her life. The position was for a cook and chambermaid at Oldwick, a sprawling 45-room Georgian mansion in rural New Jersey. It was the country estate of John Seward Johnson Sr., one of the heirs to the colossal Johnson & Johnson fortune. The interview was a disaster. Barbara admitted she couldn't cook, but there was something about her, a spark, a directness, a refusal to be intimidated, that intrigued Seward Johnson's second wife, Esther. She hired Barbara as a chambermaid instead. And so, the art historian from Poland began her new life polishing silver and making beds in the home of one of America's richest families. Her employer, J. Seward Johnson Sr., was a strange and reclusive figure. Then in his early 70s, he was known as a quiet, eccentric man who preferred the solitude of his workshops and greenhouses to the company of high society. He was deeply estranged from the 6 adult children of his first marriage, who were already immensely wealthy in their own right. He was, by all accounts, a lonely man, rattling around in a vast, opulent cage. Soon, the new Polish maid with the fiery personality caught his eye. He was impressed by her work ethic, but he was fascinated by her mind. Conversations that began about household duties slowly turned to other topics. When he discovered her background in art history, something clicked. Seward had recently developed an interest in art collecting, and in Barbara he found not just an employee, but an eager and knowledgeable guide. He began to rely on her judgment, taking her to galleries and auction houses. The chambermaid from Poland was becoming the billionaire's personal art curator. Their relationship deepened. He was captivated by her spirit, her intelligence, and her undivided attention, something he felt he no longer received from his own family. She, in turn, found in him a kind, gentle man who offered her a world of culture and security she could only have dreamed of. In 1971, just 8 days after his messy and abrupt divorce from his second wife, the 76-year-old J. Seward Johnson Sr. married his 34-year-old chambermaid, Barbara Piasecka. The wedding sent shockwaves through the Johnson family and high society. But the story was just beginning. For the next 12 years, they lived a life of quiet opulence. As Seward's health began to fail, Barbara took complete control of his care, managing his staff, his diet, and his medical needs with a fierce, unwavering devotion. Then, in May of 1983, J. Seward Johnson Sr. died at the age of 88. A few weeks later, his will was read, and the world exploded. Seward had left virtually his entire fortune, an estate valued at nearly $500 million, to his wife Barbara. To his 6 children, he left nothing but contempt, and the stage was set for the ugliest, most expensive, and most spectacular inheritance battle in American history. To understand the viciousness of the court case that followed, you have to understand the deeply fractured family at its core. This wasn't a sudden dispute. It was the eruption of a volcano that had been dormant for decades. The Johnson children, all adults with their own families and immense fortunes, saw their father's will as the final devastating act of a long and painful estrangement. For years they had felt their father slipping away from them, becoming more reclusive and distant. In their eyes, this wasn't just about the money, an amount so vast it was almost abstract. It was about their father's love, his legacy, and their very identity as his children, all of which they believed had been stolen by a manipulative outsider. Barbara, on the other hand, saw the will as the ultimate expression of her husband's love and trust, a final righteous gift to the one person who had truly cared for him in his final vulnerable years, while his own flesh and blood, in her view, remained coldly distant. The trial, which began in a Manhattan courtroom in 1986, quickly became a national obsession, a media circus of epic proportions. It was dubbed the greatest will contest in American history. On one side were the 6 Johnson children, a united front of old money and established power, represented by a phalanx of New York's toughest, most expensive lawyers. On the other was the lone widow Barbara, an immigrant with a thick Polish accent, branded in the press as the conniving gold digger. Every day she would walk into court, a solitary figure in elegant but severe suits, facing a sea of hostile faces, her expression an unreadable mask of defiance. The courtroom became a theater of private pain, where every dirty secret and bitter resentment of the Johnson family was aired out for public consumption. The children's lawyers painted a horrifying Gothic picture of Seward Johnson's final years. They brought forth a parade of former staff, maids, butlers, nurses, and groundskeepers who took the stand to testify that Barbara was a tyrannical and abusive monster. They claimed she terrorized the household with her volcanic temper, physically mistreating the frail, elderly Seward, firing anyone who dared to cross her and keeping him a virtual prisoner in his own home. Their central argument was that Seward, in his final years, was a senile and terrified old man, completely under the thumb of his young, formidable wife, and therefore lacked the mental capacity to sign a valid will. Barbara's defense team fired back with an equally compelling and completely opposite narrative. They portrayed Seward not as a doddering fool, but as a sharp, stubborn, and often cantankerous man who knew exactly what he was doing until the very end. He was, they argued, deeply hurt and disappointed by his children, whom he viewed as spoiled, ungrateful, and only interested in his money, rarely visiting unless they wanted something. Barbara, they contended, was his savior. She had brought love, passion, and intellectual stimulation back into his lonely life. Witnesses for her side testified to their genuine affection, recalling how he called her his Polish princess, and how his eyes would light up when she entered a room. They argued that her fierce protectiveness, her infamous temper, wasn't abuse. It was the ferocious love of a wife defending her ailing husband from a world she didn't trust, including his own grasping children and their loyal staff. The emotional core of the case rested on one simple, unanswerable question. Did Seward Johnson love Barbara Piasecka, or was he her victim? Every memory, every private conversation, every intimate moment of their 12-year marriage was dissected, twisted, and presented as evidence. A trip to Italy was either a romantic second honeymoon or a calculated move to isolate him. A fired butler was either a loyal employee dismissed by a cruel mistress or an insubordinate spy for the children. It was a brutal, soul-stripping process that laid bare the agony of a profoundly dysfunctional family, all while the world watched, mesmerized. The trial was a battlefield of competing narratives, and the central controversy was the character of Barbara herself. Was she the devoted caregiver, or was she the cruel tormentor? The evidence presented was a dizzying kaleidoscope of contradictions, leaving the public and the jury to wonder who the real Barbara was. The children's lawyers had a mountain of ammunition. They presented testimony that Barbara would fly into screaming rages over the smallest things, like an improperly cooked fish, throwing plates and berating the staff in a mix of Polish and broken English. A former butler tearfully claimed he saw her strike the elderly Seward in a fit of anger. A nurse testified that he was afraid of his wife and would sometimes flinch when she approached. They painted a textbook picture of a classic undue influence case where a vulnerable person is isolated and manipulated into changing their will. The fact that Seward had changed his will multiple times in his final years, each time giving more to Barbara and less to his children, seemed to be the smoking gun. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was the story of a prenuptial agreement that Seward's lawyers had drawn up before the wedding. According to testimony, Barbara had a fit, declared that love is not a contract, and tore it to pieces, a detail that the press seized upon as irrefutable proof of her greedy intentions from the very beginning. On the other side, Barbara's lawyers fought ferociously to dismantle this image. They presented their own witnesses, friends, art dealers, and different staff members who swore they saw a loving, tender, and deeply interdependent relationship. They argued that the staff who testified against Barbara were disgruntled former employees, many of whom had worked for the Johnson family for decades, and whose loyalties and pensions were tied to the children. They skillfully portrayed Barbara not as a monster, but as a proud, hot-blooded European woman, an immigrant in a foreign land, surrounded by a hostile family and staff who was naturally defensive and protective. Her temper, they argued, was a sign of her passion, not her cruelty, the reaction of a perfectionist who demanded the best for her husband. And they had their own powerful, tangible evidence. They produced handwritten notes and memos from Seward Johnson himself, written in his final years, which seemed to show he was of sound mind and deeply in love with his wife. In one, he allegedly scrawled that his children already had more money than was good for them, and that he wanted to leave his fortune to the woman who was taking care of him in his old age. This was the crux of Barbara's defense. It was his money, his life, and his decision, and he had every right to do what he wanted with it. After 4 grueling months of testimony and millions of dollars in legal fees, with the case about to go to the jury, a stunning development occurred. The two sides settled. The pressure, the publicity, and the sheer cost of the fight had become too much. The judge, who had overseen the entire spectacle, famously called the settlement a business deal, not a resolution of the truth, and seemed relieved it was over. Under the terms, Barbara would receive the lion's share of the estate, around $350 million. The 6 children would split approximately $40 million, and a significant portion went to a medical research institute Seward had founded. The settlement meant the central questions were never answered by a jury. Was Seward Johnson competent? Did Barbara Piasecka manipulate him? Was it love, or was it greed? The court never decided. Barbara had won the fortune, but the victory came at the cost of her reputation, leaving her forever frozen in the public imagination at the center of this unresolved, tantalizing debate. She walked away one of the richest women in the world, but the shadow of the courtroom would follow her for the rest of her life. The end of the trial marked the beginning of Barbara Piasecka Johnson's third act, and it was in this final chapter that she would build her true and far more complex legacy. Imagine the silence after the storm. The courtroom doors close, the reporters disperse, and she is left with a victory so total it's almost isolating. She had won, but she was a pariah, forever branded by the battle she had endured. No longer just the controversial widow, she now had a fortune so vast it was almost unimaginable, and the absolute freedom to do whatever she wanted with it. And what she wanted to do with a furious, single-minded determination was build a world of art and beauty that would rival any in the world, a world that would silence the gossip and speak for itself. Her first major project was the creation of a home, but to call it a home is an understatement. It was a declaration. She bought a 300-acre property near Princeton, New Jersey, and began construction on a lavish estate she named Jasna Polana, or Bright Meadow in Polish. It was a powerful nod to her homeland, a sprawling 46,000 square foot neoclassical palace designed to evoke the great country houses of 18th century Poland. This was not some humble cottage. It was a fortress of taste, a monument built to prove the world wrong. It was her statement piece, a declaration of her victory, and her discerning eye, complete with gleaming marble floors, grand ballrooms, an indoor swimming pool, formal gardens, and of course cavernous, perfectly lit galleries to house the treasures she was about to acquire. This was her personal kingdom, a place of absolute control after years of having her life and character dissected by strangers. And it was that art collection that became her life's great passion. Now, with a virtually unlimited budget, the former art history student from Wrocław became one of the most powerful and feared players in the international art market. She wasn't a dilettante who just bought what was fashionable on the advice of a dealer. She was a serious, scholarly, and obsessive collector. She was a hunter. With her art history degree as her map and the Johnson fortune as her ammunition, she pursued masterpieces with a relentless focus, specializing in old master paintings and sculptures, particularly from the Baroque period. She would sit at auctions in London and New York, a quiet, inscrutable figure, and raise her paddle, calmly outbidding not just other billionaires, but entire museums, including the mighty Getty. She bought masterpieces by Rembrandt, Raphael, Caravaggio, and Vermeer. Her collection became so significant that major museums around the world would request loans for their exhibitions, treating her not as a mere owner, but as a respected custodian of cultural heritage. She was no longer J. Seward Johnson's art curator. She was a global force in the art world, proving that her passion and knowledge were genuine all along. Each masterpiece she acquired was another brick in the wall of her new identity, transforming the tabloid caricature into a respected connoisseur. Beyond her life as a collector, Barbara also became a significant philanthropist, and her giving was as personal and passionate as her art collecting. She focused intently on her native Poland. During the 1980s, while the world watched the rise of the anti-communist solidarity movement, Barbara was a quiet but staunch financial supporter. This wasn't just a detached act of charity, this was personal. The woman who had escaped the gray oppression of the communist regime was now using the fortune she had won in America to help finance its downfall. Later in life, she also founded institutes to aid autistic children in both the U.S. and Poland, a cause she became deeply passionate about, showing a compassionate, nurturing side the public had rarely been allowed to see. Her significance, therefore, is twofold. The will contest itself became a landmark case in American legal history, a brutal cautionary tale about wealth, family, and inheritance that is still studied in law schools today. But her personal legacy is what she built from the ashes of that public battle. She used her controversial fortune to create a world-class art collection and a powerful philanthropic foundation, consciously and deliberately transforming herself from a one-dimensional tabloid caricature into a respected, if still intensely reclusive, patron of the arts and a champion for her homeland. She had fought tooth and nail for the money, but she used it to create something of lasting cultural value. In the end, how do we remember Barbara Piasecka Johnson? Was she the Cinderella who got her fairy tale ending, or the cunning schemer who pulled off the ultimate heist? The truth of her story, like the woman herself, defies any simple label. Her life was a cascade of contradictions. The art historian who worked as a maid, the loving wife who was accused of being a monster, the intensely private, reclusive billionaire who built a palace for the world to see her art. Her journey from the gray conformity of communist Poland to the unbelievable opulence of the Johnson dynasty is more than just a rags to riches story. It's a saga about the ferocious power of human ambition. It's a story about the complex, often blurry lines between love, companionship, and dependency, especially when immense wealth enters the equation. She was without a doubt a difficult, demanding, and fiery woman, but she was also brilliant, determined, and possessed of an undeniable passion for beauty that bordered on obsession. Perhaps the greatest lesson from her life is that legacies are not static. For years, she was defined by a single scandalous event, but with the time and resources she won in that brutal fight, she meticulously and deliberately rewrote her own story. She built a legacy not on the gossip pages, but on the museum walls of the world, a legacy of art, philanthropy, and a fierce, unapologetic commitment to her own vision. Barbara Piasecka Johnson fought for a fortune, but what she was really fighting for from the very beginning was the chance to live the life of beauty she had first dreamed of in a small gray town a world away. And in her magnificent lonely palace surrounded by masterpieces, one has to wonder if, after all the battles she ever truly found it.